Ola iken nom ke yahahu submen kwalayo submen hasta helayo hipmen kwanu Ola iken nom ke Submen kwalayo submen hasta helayo hipmen kwanu Ola iken nom ke yahahu submen kwalayo submen hasta helayo hipmen kwanu Ola iken nom ke yahahu submen kwalayo hasta helayo hipmen kwanu The last part of the song is the, he told us, William Wasden, he told us, the whoo, it's a bird on the beach at Alert Bay, and it's the song that the bird sings when it first sees the light come up. So it's a bird song. Yeah. And of course, I'm a northern person, and I'm sort of like trying to hear with my northern Tahltan ears, Kwakwaka'wakw words. So I sang the song 100 times because Simon Reese told me, if you want to learn a song, you have to sing it 100 times. And then Alec Nelson, a really smart, wonderful Kwakwaka'wakw elder, he said, well, when you sing it, it doesn't sound right. I was like, that's right. Well, because I'm not Kwakwaka'wakw. I'm learning the song in a different language, listening with Tahltan Nation ears, and I realized that when I sing it, it sounds more Tahltan than Kwakwaka'wakw. Yeah, so that's my disclaimer.
Thank you, though.
Mm-hmm.
A song for the children that we worked with who were removed from their communities so that they could have a song to sing themselves home.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you all for coming from far and from nearby, just around the corner. Thank you for coming. So just to set this up properly and to set up our conversation properly, I'm going to read a bit of a narrative that kind of gives everybody a sense of where we're starting from. And of course, everybody who's going to ultimately watch the video will get a sense of where we're coming from as well. So if I stumble, it's just because I haven't rehearsed 100 times. So there's that. So this project stems from a chance discovery of painter and former U of T German prof Barker Fairley's name that showed up in a work of mine called the 1911 Anti-Creek Negro Petition, which is currently touring in Lisa's group exhibition, Carry Forward. The petition was generated by Alberta businessmen who demanded that Prime Minister Laurier stop an influx of Afro-Creek people who were fleeing racial violence and mass lynchings in Indian Territory, which is now known as Oklahoma. The petition insisted that they would resort to anti-Black lynch mobs if he did not heed their demands. My great-grandparents and my grandparents' siblings were part of that migration. our family has been in Canada for over 100 years. This research leads me here to this stage, to this Hart House building, where I'm working through the extended implications that Fairley's signature highlights via his critical role in crafting and championing the Group of Seven's unpeopled landscapes as emblems of Canadian culture, and their role in Vincent Massey's ambitions for a white Canadian nation. These ambitions are evident in Fairley and Massey's writings, many of which are housed in U of T's Hart House and Fisher Library archives. I chanced upon the script for the play, The God of Gods, while researching in the Hart House Digital Archive. The work is a red-faced play written by apple farmer, playwright, director Carroll Aikins in 1922. Fairley, Massey, and several other key players of Toronto's social elite sat on the Hart House Theatre's Board of Syndics, with Fairley serving as secretary for the art committee that approved staging Aikins' play. Aikins was influenced by the burgeoning ideas of the Little Theatre movement that was rampant in the US and Canada when he founded the Home Theatre in Naramata, BC in 1920, in the Penticton area. His nationalist pandering caught the eye of Hart House's Board of Syndics, which led to his tenure as the Hart House Theatre's first Canadian-born artistic director in 1927 through 1929. Quoting the Hart House Theatre's website bio, Aikins was born of a family that had a long history of wealth and prestige. Carroll's maternal grandfather, the Honourable C.C. Colby, was Stanstead's Member of Parliament from 1867 to 1891, and the President of the Privy Council under Sir John A. Macdonald, while his paternal grandfather, Sir James Cox Aikins, was a Senate appointee and served under Macdonald as the Cabinet Secretary of State from 1869 to 73, and then again in 78 to 1880. Before he became the Lieutenant Governor of Manitoba, 1882 to 1888. Carroll's father, John Somerset Aikins, served in the Manitoba House of Assembly for a single term between 1879 and 1883. Aikins was part of the same social circles as Fairley, Massey, the G7 painters A.J. Casson, A.Y. Jackson, Lauren Harris, J.E.H. MacDonald, and a constellation of artists, writers, and society figures that include author, painter Bertram Brooker, poets Jesse Middleton and Albert Smythe, Confederation poet and bureaucrat Duncan Campbell Scott, newspaper publisher William Southam, businessman Timothy Eaton, OCAD principal G.A. Reed, G7 painter and OCAD vice principal Arthur Lismer, composer Ernest Macmillan, painter Walter Phillips, and the former Hart House Theatre artistic directors Bertram Forsyth, Frederick Coates, and Roy Mitchell, architect Barry Cleveland, anthropologist Marius Barbeau, and mezzo-soprano ethnomusicologist Juliette Gaultier. Put another way, this network of politically and financially wealthy white people had mutual interests and shared values that would become the primary mandate of the governments, businesses, and cultural institutions that shape every facet of Canadian overculture to this day. You know about the mythology of the Group of Seven painters and Governor General Vincent Massey, amongst the other things these other characters did. Polymath Bertram Brooker, understood to be Canada's first abstract painter. Jesse Middleton wrote foundational chronologies of the city of Toronto and the province of Ontario, with both detailing and enshrining the major society figures of their times. Albert Smythe founded the Toronto Theosophical Society. Duncan Campbell Scott was Deputy Superintendent of the Department of Indian Affairs from 1913 to 32. William Southam owned newspapers in Hamilton, Calgary, Edmonton, Winnipeg, Windsor, and Montreal, of which all of Carroll Aikins' positive reviews were published in those newspapers. Who else we got? Marius Barbeau would stage the first exhibition of Indigenous objects along with new works by several Group of Seven members at the AGO in 1927. Juliette Gaultier sang Indigenous songs at the opening reception clad in Indigenous garb and red-face makeup. Timothy Eaton's department store was a long-standing patron of the Hart House Theatre. Reed and Lismer were senior administrators at Ontario College of Art. Most, but not all, of these people were members of the Arts and Letters Club, and several sat on the executive boards of Toronto's most important cultural institutions, including Hart House, the Art Gallery of Ontario, the Ontario College of Art, the Arts and Letters Club, the National Gallery, and the Royal Ontario Museum. In 1926-27, Vincent Massey worked to establish The God of Gods as an example of seminal Canadian theatre in his two-volume edition, Canadian Plays from the Hart House Theatre. Contemporary scholars have rationalized the overt racism of The God of Gods by arguing that the ideologies of the play reflect the ideas of the time. That is, that anti-Indigenous racism was intrinsically woven into everyday life in Canada. Additional justifications point to the ideological influences of theosophy and the global art trends such as primitivism and modernism. Given the platform and the historical context of my exhibition, we're here because it's Hart House's 100th anniversary. I thought this was an ideal opportunity to unpack and highlight or reveal the ecology that God of Gods emerged from so that we can deconstruct the text for its ongoing historical and contemporary impact. Our discussion today revolves around how the God of Gods stage play cannot be reenacted, but I say that with an understanding that we can also have a conversation about why it should. So that's where we start. I have other questions for you, but I actually want to start with a question of whether or not you think this kind of a play could be reenacted.
To me, the only purpose in restaging this particular work and the other work, the many, many, many other works like it, some of which are still being produced today, would be to do it as a meta-narrative where the sections of the play would be presented and then reframed with contemporary understanding. The excuse that this reflected the values of the day, absolutely. All of our works do, no matter what we're doing. But what really came to me, just as you were speaking, Deanna, was how little has changed. I mean, when I talk to regular Canadians about Native folks, it's clear that they don't know a damn thing about us, like just not a damn thing. And they are still struggling with these ridiculous and antiquated notions of who we are, why we are, what we do, what we believe, what we think, who we are. There were a few moments where I was quite outraged, as I expected to be reading the play. And then it dawned on me, it's like, well, there's nothing to be outraged about. This is profoundly not about us. Mm-hmm. There is nothing Indigenous about this play. This reflects, I am not an Indigenous ethnographer, but I've been a few places, and whenever I go somewhere, I always try and find the Indians and see what's going on. And there's literally not a single thing within the play that reflects in any way, shape, or form any Indigenous culture I've ever come in contact with. So that really helped me. That gave me this tremendous space in which I could just read the play and go, how about that? Look at that. Look at that. And I just had to keep coming back to.
It's not real.
It's not even that it's not real. It is real. That's the problem. It is real. That's the problem. It is real.
But the thing that it's real about is the deep foundation of white supremacy in Canadian culture. And
Absolutely.
So this meta-narrative that you propose of a hypothetical, presentation of the play today, it would involve an all-white cast. It would hopefully be able to acknowledge that the politics of the time that are not so different from now is this undergirding of white supremacy. It would link between then and now.
Yeah, I would
and put like the real
sorry.
content at the center of it. Yeah.
Yeah. I would propose a native cast in whiteface. Yeah, I would.
I'm kind of feeling that.
Yeah.
The additional layer of whiteface, right? I think is super, and actually it's a question that I've been kind of grappling with. I came to the play and I invited you all here largely because of my understandings of blackface and what that means, right? And redface and what that means. But what exactly would whiteface, what would that look like? And what would its political impact be? I don't know that we have to have an answer to that, but I think it's something to consider as a counter gesture.
I did a performance. Ayumi Goto and I, it was called First Context ? And we were putting on the literary racist imaginations concerning our specific bodies. So I became a red man, and she became a yellow woman, and it actually. So I put on the red face, like I put on this thing, and it hurt. It really hurt a lot, actually. And I think, of course, performance is this other piece around expansion of your body and rupture and risk. And in the moment I was putting on the red face in order to meet my co-partner in the performance, I realized how much I fought to not have those things touch my body, And so I wonder about this idea of whiteface too, because I'm like, I don't want to put that on. The harm that happens inside of us just to even propose it. The physicality of it is also a thing. Like, I'm not sure if I'm a pretty good performance artist, I think, but I don't know if I'm that good, but also I would be up to the challenge.
From my perspective, I'm going to talk about my mom and this understanding of how, as far as blackness goes, that there is such a thing as a white voice. So when my mom's in front of white people, she shifts into a different persona.
Yeah.
And literally the language, the way that she speaks is different, the way that she engages is different. So in many ways, I kind of imagine that as already being a kind of white face mask.
Okay, yeah.
So I'm wondering if, literally the gesture of painting that on the face and kind of taking up that kind of space, whether or not there's a kind of political power in that. Does that make sense?
It totally does, yeah.
I mean, because we all ultimately put on a face of some sort in order to engage with everyday life, right? And to engage with white people for the most part, right? I am well aware, certainly within my life, that, and our queerness, really, right? Yeah. I'm well aware that I put on all kinds of different faces in order to engage with these people. So would making that face visible, what would it do?
It would function very differently, right? Because in terms of the culture we're in, whiteness is the unmarked.
Yeah.
So, black face, red face function because those are marked racial categories.
Yeah.
And so to mark yourself with the unmarked for default, it's awkward, right?
Yeah.
And so at the time this was being written, the social context, it's in the States under Jim Crow, in Oklahoma, where your introduction around this the anti-Creek Negro petition of the people fleeing Oklahoma the people fleeing were categorized as black, but the Indians in Oklahoma were white at that time, legally white, and that's how they could become citizens because of the Citizen Naturalization Act. Not elsewhere in the States, but in Indian country. And then something similar with Duncan Campbell Scott being, a very large looming figure in the assimilationist agenda of Canada was also around this idea of turning Indians white, killing the Indian and the child as a benevolent gesture. And so there's something interesting in here in the, like I see this as a play not about Indians. It's not about, it's based in BC broadly. or
Whoa.
it's based, yes.
Are you getting that just from this sort of scene, landscape type?
From the landscape and from where Carroll is from and where he's writing this, but it's also it's completely, like it's based on, it's an invented Indian at the time that's made for the construction of white Canada. And so of this creating a primitive, like if you are grown up thinking of the evils of religion through a lens of Catholicism, through the veiled references to Islam in here, of like thinking of organized religion and where the evils can reside in idolatry and when it becomes too much a cult of personality, then so there's trying to imagine what would be a very primitive form of this type of organized religion that I'm familiar with as a privileged white male in the early 20th century in Canada, and finding, trying to trace back to this primitive form of religion that I'm familiar with and seeing where a pure form of it could exist, where that rupture happened, and trying to identify that and rescue a form. Like there's a crisis in there of wanting a pure spirituality and seeing the corruption around you, and then using the most proximate, the closest primitive that you have in your imagination to as a tool for that. So it's strange to find, like this is almost in very stark contrast to that assimilation, because it's trying to take, invent an Indian that we can occupy, that we can use as a tool to purify, to find a pure whiteness, to find a pure form of humanity that can work as a foundation for the Canada that we want to construct, this universalist Canada that also is so that a simultaneous.
So what, I like what you're saying. So red face is white face.
Yeah.
Black face is white face.
Say again?
Red face is white face.
Yeah.
Black face is white face. If you're thinking about what you're saying about by assuming this identity, that is this constructed identity, and creating it and then assuming it is part of a whiteness.
It's marking themselves, right? That's, if I'm understanding correctly, like it's making a space for that whiteness. You put that on, and then, so it's all the white mask on a white body for a white place.
This is this is a moment where that white mask is being constructed, where Canada's version of it is still very much under construction.
So the piece is about white people.
For me.
Well, it's sure not about us.
It points to what very much what you were saying about white supremacy in Canada.
Well, but
it's like thinking about Said's Orientalism, like that the construction of the East was what it really spoke about what the West. It was about what the West stood for. If I want to break it down into that kind of thing. But.
I think it also wants to construct an Indigenous population for a white colonizer that can absolve the guilt or violence of the colonial project through a subsumption of Indigenous identity as white. So by having white actors put on red face to tell the story about the crumbling of an Indigenous community, it has, I imagine, one of the consequences of that at the time would be that for the actors, or more precisely for the audience, that they would feel themselves in alignment with that somehow like Indigenous identity and white identity could be conflated so that the presence of a settler population here becomes naturalized or neutralized in some way to allow the perpetuation of colonialism without guilt. This is part of like the imagination. I imagine that these networks of white men perhaps inadvertently but very powerfully were constructing or enacting, you know, this like cleansing.
And theosophy is part of that, I think, too.
Yeah.
But also, I don't know how, I like the list of names that you read at the beginning. I'm like, how many of them felt guilty about their involvement, you know?
Well,
Like,
I don't think that they probably did, but I do think that there's something in like the background that,
Like a paternalism.
yeah, or like a, yeah, I don't think that they felt guilty, but I do think that they needed to make themselves feel more at home.
oh, that's,
There's assuredness, yeah. There's a. I don't think there was. They can't. It's. I don't know how to put it into words exactly, but there was an assured. I'm sure there was an assuredness about
They're right.
their position. Yeah, and that, and there wasn't even a reflection on it. But I wasn't there, but I feel like I get that from this whole scene.
Yeah.
It's also important, sorry.
Oh no, I just feel like also the construction of the Indigenous community in this play is so degrading that I can imagine it becoming a kind of justification for colonization. Like these people, you know,
Right.
if this stands in as a representation of the forms of life that were here when the colonizer arrived, like of course they needed to be saved by us or something, right? It's like the construction of a population that needs these men, that like
Right.
perhaps this goes back to not
Right.
guilt but paternalism
Sure,
or like a
yeah.
hero complex or something.
Which is the way that slavery and anti-black racism is justified, right? Same logic of look at just how they can't take care of themselves, how they procreate endlessly, like all of the stereotypes that go with blackness. And of course, we also see that happening literally right now with the current American political situation.
Yeah.
Of a government that is taking the position of one, creating the crisis, the kind of ground level situation that makes people, creates poverty, creates all of the kind of things that they also like to come back and point to for all the reasons why they need to eradicate or, or kill or take care of or manage and or survey.
Well, I mean, like right now, it's beautiful to have these kind of conversations, and I love how these coming togethers or these gatherings always open up a different avenue or different pathway for thinking. And I just like right now, it just sounds like legal language, like a justification, or you have to prove this in court later, so we have to like talk about this sort of like thing, you know, like justification for racism or colonialism or something, you know. And I'm like, when did the people beyond that list, the white people beyond that list, actually start becoming aware that these things were going on, you know? Or like, I'm not sure, like
Which things?
the colonial manifest destiny as perpetrated and the machinations that maybe I'm just picking on these that list because it's quite a list, you know. But
There's more.
Oh yeah, there's always more,
so many
you know.
more.
But
Yeah.
the outfolding of it, like when it, you know, like the outfolding of the resource extraction and the killing and the violence and the pushing people onto reserves and you know, killing of killing of bodies that are non-white and not invited into these rooms, you know, those specific rooms,
Yeah.
right? Because you know, we talk. You know, I'm just also thinking about what John was saying. The invented Indian, like what? Like that's a, you know, for years it was the imaginary Indian, which is so elusive, and but the invented Indian is a whole other thing. Like I could get in that.
Yeah.
Like that. This is an invention. Indian bodies can get inside of that invention and play around. I was also like imagining the maps of the invented landscape and the how cartographers are like, you know, reading accounts of things of these territories and sort of dreaming up a map, you know. There's more culpability with invention and more responsibility, I think.
How so?
I think, isn't there, you have sort of an investment in the output
Sure.
of the invention.
The enterprise.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about when did they become aware that this was happening, so that they could justify it, makes me think that this isn't, like it's not a conscious justification of the colonization, because that's just something that they would breathe, right? And so I imagine this is like that. The perceived intent of this is probably quite benevolent, right? It's quite learned and tolerant. Like theosophy is a doctrine of tolerance that underlies the fiction or the belief of a multicultural Canada, of this self-perception of being very accepting and benevolent, and you know, in the little introduction about the theosophy, it talks about it being really rooted in this research into religion, this research and tolerance into religion, which is just deeply hypocritical. This idea that there's like in the complete ignorance that goes into the portrayal of Indigenous people in this play, while speaking of the ignorance of Indigenous people, of you know, that they think that the world is round like a sheep's bladder. that line.
Some kind of bladder, anyway.
In there, right?
A few bladders mentioned.
Portraying the ignorance of the Indigenous people, like in this deeply ignorant place.
And also but I also think within that benevolence is a kind of cultural capital by saying, here in Canada we have these Indians, and here we can present this as sort of like one of the sort of topics that you were thinking, you know, give us a question ahead of time, was around, you know, this being uniquely Canadian theater. And so like marking, you know, so it's used as this kind of cultural capital in a way that is really kind of gets tied up in all of that too. That's
how this unknown playwright got his play mounted in the UK, like through, you know, we've got here's something new.
Yeah.
We've got these Indians.
Although I think it's a really interesting proposition to take this story that is serving some kind of purpose in a colonial project and then follow the vector of colonization back to the heart of empire. And part of the history that is written in this critical edition is that when the play was brought back to Europe, to the UK, that it flopped as a play. And I find that really interesting, although it was written about as a success when the narrative was brought back to Canada. But what does it mean that, you take a story about colonization, you plop it down in the heart or, the engine of a colonial project, and people there don't care to engage. I don't know, not that that's a better or worse response than it being, positively lauded here in Canada, but gave me a moment of pause when I was reading through it.
The one time, so the play was restaged two times in the UK, and the latter one was in 1931. So Aikins finished here in 29, and then it was restaged in 31. But what was interesting about the 31 version of it is that it was performed much more as a minstrel show, and then that was where the sole kind of the only more favorable review out of the UK productions came out of the fact that the vaudevillian, the minstrel aspect of it made it that much more comical. And so I'm fascinated by that for the ways that how does that cross-pollinate? How is it acceptable to kind of cross particular types of stereotypical representation? If that makes any sense at all. Blackface, like that whole thing is always going to be acceptable, clearly. And this idea that blackface, redface is somewhat interchangeable, but then there's something about redface needs to be kind of done in a better way in the UK for it to be received. And in its failure, they introduce something that does have legs, so to speak, which is blackface and the whole minstrel aspect of it all. So I'm fascinated by how that happens. Right, and what is the thought process behind the exchange, other than straight up business concerns about how do you keep a play, how do you make it break even?
Yeah. To my mind, I can visualize the failure of the play in England, in London especially, because look at these pathetic wretches. What glory is there for the empire in us vanquishing a people such as these? Whereas the more popular entertainments of the era were the ferocious, dangerous Indians who we managed to overcome because God was on our side, essentially.
And we are so powerful and masculine.
And we're better. We're just better. So I want to back up just quickly and say that I am in no way suggesting remounting this play with Native people in There's so much to do.
Beyond this.
It was just a thinking exercise.
It was purely a thought experiment. The one thing that I loved about this play, because I kept waiting for it to happen, and I think this is maybe a cultural thing that started later with the writings of, brain fart, German guy.
Karl May?
Karl May, Karl May's writings, was that I kept expecting the great white hero to appear and become better at being native than all the natives combined, because that is typically the narrative.
I mean, that is Carroll himself.
Yes, but it doesn't actually transpire within the context of the play, right? So I had to say, okay, I'm just going to give you a gold star for that. It didn't bring in the white guy who's better, because, that is constantly the narrative, right?
So yes, it doesn't happen within the play, but it happens in the city.
But it's happening in the context of the culture, and it's also very important to look at this piece and when it was written and mounted in the context of what was happening culturally at the time. Going back to our dear friend, Duncan Campbell Scott.
Failed poet.
War criminal. I was going to say war criminal.
Okay, much better.
He was very much instrumental in the whole, the residential school systems, the systematic starvation of us post treaty signing. And for me, critically, the mass arrests that followed the big potlatch in Alert Bay in 1923, when all of the chiefs were arrested and faced with you can sign away this is when they started enforcing the ban on ceremony. They didn't enforce it, or they enforced it very spottily from 1873. I think, up until the 20s, and that's when they brought the hammer down and they arrested all the chiefs and said, if you agree to not potlatch any longer, we will return your regalia, which was a lie. Trainloads of regalia, masks, ceremonial objects left Alert Bay. a lot of chiefs refused and went to Ocala Prison in Vancouver, and spent a considerable amount of time there. And this was Scott. This was all Scott. So to me that's the framework of this play.
For sure.
Right? Yeah. And that's something that I always have to keep coming back to. Right?
So if you think about it, then you have this person writing a play that has Indigenous people practicing an Indigenous way of life, albeit an invented one, at the same time that real Indigenous people are being persecuted under Canadian law for being Indigenous.
Exactly.
Repressing ceremony and inventing new ones.
And Indigenous culture is being actively performed by these same white people at the same time. So there's this other layer that's also happening and so it does bring us back to this idea of white people performing indigeneity better than Indigenous people, right? So that was actively happening, right? And there is, I can't remember where I saw this. It could have been Arts and Letters Club, but there is an understanding, maybe it's Bertram Brooker's 7 Arts articles, that there was an understanding that it was these white men. These white men were literally kind of caretakers of Indigenous culture, and they had defined what was Indigenous culture. So anything prior to their discovery was quote unquote authentic, and anything that happened after that was not authentic. And one, and then two, the other part is that they felt it was their responsibility to interpret Indigenous culture and teach it back to Indigenous people.
The salvage paradigm. The other layer to it is it was performed originally by all men, right?
Yep.
So the other layer is men assuming
performing
as Indigenous women, which is hugely disturbing. And I don't know. I don't know if I picked up that detail until like maybe when I got here today. So that added a whole other thing that I've been thinking
Barbara
about.
Fisher and I were talking about this because on paper, on the actual playbill for the piece, it says that there are a number of women that were performers.
Okay.
But Hart House didn't allow women at that time frame. Hart House didn't allow women in this building until the 1970s. So, and that included performers. At least that's understood to be the story, that women were not allowed in here, except to be an audience, right?
Till the late 70s?
70s. 1970s.
Well, theater is a ceremony, and what if someone's on their moon time? I mean, come on.
What are we going to do about that? What would we do?
As long as it's waning.
I don't think that was right.
That was not a thought process.
That's what waning moon means.
Ridiculous. So here's the thing, though. On paper, it says that there are women.
Okay. So
The photographs, however, speak otherwise.
Yeah.
So in this critical edition, there are photographs that illustrate that there are men performing the female roles. So Barbara and I were talking about, okay, so what is true? I can't possibly see how it would be that women weren't allowed in the 1960s or anything prior to 1970. I've seen Duncan Campbell Scott staged a play here in 1926 that had a female lead, so I know that, and there's photographs of that. So it brings us back to this other question, which is whether or not the mythology was something that was constructed and maintained for its own purposes, or whether or not there legitimately were women that were brought into the campus and that was okay, or what's what. I'm not quite sure. It might be a mixture of all of these things, but certainly for this play, the photo documentation points to the reality that the women's roles were performed by men. The UK performances have women. Okay. I think that that's important to consider, and certainly at the very least, the photographs that speak to what was staged here does illustrate that switching of roles. And so, yeah, what does it mean? I mean, there's something else kind of going on here. I have my own thoughts around this fraternity of men and the deep, deep friendships that are kind of documented over the course of these men's lives. And I don't know what queerness looks like in that time frame, but I have my suspicions. So do we call it drag? Is the short of it. Deeply, 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 deeply racist drag.
There's so many layers of drag
going on
there,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I mean, the thing that I'm veering off topic now, but just how debased and degraded the culture that is depicted is.
Yeah.
Right. Just like this savage, decayed, immoral, debased thing. You know, like the whole, like every page is like, wow. Okay.
But within that community, even it's the female characters that are carrying that debasedness and degradation. So you have
Yes.
Waning Moon, who is at the heart of why the religion of the tribe is fundamentally a sham. And then it's inherited by Sawiva, who then cannot even carry the weight of that religion for a 24-hour period. So it's, I don't know.
She was never
It's
taught.
intersectional.
Where's her
Okay, there's that. So the God of Gods was championed as a prime example of Canadian theatre. Do you have an opinion about the implications of this perspective as it relates to colonial violence, cultural erasure, or Canadian cultural identity?
Yeah, I might have a thought or two on that.
Give it to me.
All right. And these are all points that have been touched on already, but
Yep.
what this play exists for primarily is a reification and justification of the colonial project as a whole and white supremacy at its core. Right? I mean, it's just so plainly and risibly that, you know, which absolves any methodologies that are employed to rescue these benighted savages. I mean, look at the way these people live. I mean, that is always the line, right? Like, look at the way these people live. It's like, well, if you actually looked, you might be surprised, right? But there is no, surprisingly, I guess, there's no single character who rises up as a beacon of hope for these people, right? Like they're just.
It's just dire.
It's just dire. It's like everything's wrong. There's no way out. Sawiva is. I mean, at least she has some qualms about becoming this charlataness. Is that a word? I just invented a word.
made it a word.
I just invented a word.
It's great.
Thank you.
It works.
But also like running with Cheyenne's talking about, you know, she is too weak to overcome her base desires, right? She has to have, what's his name? Yellowknife?
Yellow snake.
Yeah. She desires yellow snake so much. She commits all these cardinal sins and bringing him into the space and doing all this stuff and so it is just another example of, here is why manifest destiny is the best practice.
Well, so Sawiva's the hero in a sense, and the tragedy is that she trusts in the system, but there's Yellow Snake, starts off, you start off suspicious of Yellow Snake, and then he proves himself. And there's an interesting part in the notes about speaking of this, them as progressives, this progressive form of sexuality that's not,
doesn't require women to be virgins in order to be worthy of love.
Yes. Yeah, and so showing, it's interesting.
So forward thinking.
Yeah, the leadership in the community demanding that chastity, and then and there's something about their instincts being true over that leadership. Yeah.
I think Yellow Snake's supposed to be the hero, and the fact that he's murdered by the community is why Indigenous people are
Lost.
Yeah. I think that's how
couldn't tell if this was, so when I first read it, I couldn't tell if this was anti-religion or anti-savage religion. And I think it's, the theosophical core is, I'm confused
About what it is.
around that, but it does seem to me to, like, it's anti-organized religion, it's promoting a personal path towards God, like it's trusting an instinct more than your elders.
So long as your
It's
instinct.
anti-elder.
Right.
I thought the hero was the character who was looking in the pool of
Oh.
water
Leary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, he's definitely the one that speaks the truth.
throughout the whole thing.
Yeah. So the mad character.
The
who's
mad
necessary.
character
Yeah.
is the hero in the piece, which I think is interesting. I don't know what that would connect to in contemporary society of the time, but
He's the fool, right?
He's
and
the
the fool
fool.
speaks the truth, right? The play's got some of these broader
Shakespearean
tropes,
things.
yeah.
Conventions.
Yeah, which it's in a way it's this broken. This more broke-ass version of the collapse of the Roman Empire.
basically.
Yeah, if the collapse of the Roman Empire happened on the res,
I was going to say that.
Then it would look like this. Yeah.
Look, there stands Caesar next to the band office.
and this invented Indian is something that's carried forward in contemporary understandings, because this is the corruption of the band council, right?
Right.
This is finding the origins of those tropes and those things that we're going to take your potlatch away. We're going to invent new ceremonies, new governance, new tropes for you to now adopt. And so you can't look at this, but you can look at these plays, at Hollywood renditions, and to create these new role models.
Oh my God. the way John's putting it, I'm like, it just makes me feel sadder and sadder. Like, I gotta watch John Wayne movies to figure out how to be an Indian or something, Like, I actually didn't read it I didn't find I don't know if I was looking for a hero or like I didn't read that. I didn't look at these words that way. Like, I was attracted to the fool, I guess. Yeah. Because I think there was space around the dialogue that the fool was offering to the narrative, which I was very interested in, and I wondered what that space meant.
Or like who would take up that space?
Yeah.
In the piece.
In the piece, yeah.
Or in the audience.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely, yeah. But I couldn't, I did enjoy the elder character a lot, but I don't know. There's something like your question about for right now it just feels so insidious. All of this is just sort of like pouring out of this room, like. So now I'm just like walking around in my mind. I'm just walking around like, okay. How is this room and this play reflecting what I think my experience could be, and why the fuck do I care anymore? It's funny. It's a very funny room we're in, And
This room.
Yeah. And also the multitude of moments of invented Indian and invented blackness and invented Asianness, and how we're so trained to like look at that.
We were talking about what
Historians?
historians were or were not doing, and the naming the unnamed.
Well, you asked what were they, like what conscious decisions would they have to make to not write about what these plays were doing, to not name the racism in it, and I think that connects back to the beginning of our discussion around the unmarked, because it's this it's an unmarked dialogue. The only thing that can be marked is the indigeneity, not the position from which the writer is coming. So they can have these conversations about the Native Canadians in the play, but not about Carroll Aikins's identity.
But that brings me back to this. I'm sorry, Peter.
Plug your ears.
It's fine. We're trying things out.
You know, when I'm trying to think about it practically, again, and that's kind of some of the exercise for me, is like in the naming of the names of all of these people and all that stuff, just imagining quite practically what an individual would have to do, like the thought process that would go through one's mind to read it, acknowledge it for what it is. And I don't know where it would go from there. Would it be something like, I can't say this because, or, you know, or whatever it is. And maybe how all of that thought process of seeing it and then choosing not to deal with it ultimately kind of speaks to the way that racism functions within society.
I mean,
Right.
on that note, perhaps there were art historians who were, historicizing it in this way, but those narratives are not subsumed into the great narrative of art history or what have you,
Right.
for precisely these same reasons.
Right, right. I mean, I can say quite honestly that I gave pause to this idea of chasing this down. I thought about the billions of dollars that has gone into the manufacture of this particular narrative and the Group of Seven themselves, and how much money flows through the art world via the marketing and the dissemination and the touring of these works, right? And thinking about how much the AGO, as an example, is going through as they try to make an argument for deaccessioning Group of Seven paintings, right, in the current, like right now. For, ironically enough, for the purposes of making space in their collection for other people that have not been in it. So, you know, I think a lot about, all of those things as it relates to kind of choices, conscious choices. And I don't know who is driving the beast by example at the AGO that's kind of making the decision to get rid of the Group of Seven or things
One
like
in
that.
Anna Bush. Well, I don't know, but if I was going to hazard a guess.
Who could it be? I was going to say something really career-ending, so never mind. The point of it all is that it does bring us back to a number of points that we've made around.
What were you just saying about what stops people from saying things?
You're not supposed to be that smart. I invited you to be smart, but not that smart. I'm just going to leave that. And I'm going to go forward a little bit and then pose a question around. There was an article that was out there in the world. Ravi Jain from Why Not Theatre had put out an essay about the Massey Commission and the need for another Massey Commission or something along those lines to basically rethink all of the legacy of what the first Massey Commission and the creation of the Canada Council and all those things, what that means, what that could be to kind of take it apart as a national kind of task, exercise, something along those lines. Could you see that? Could you see it happening? Could you, in the spirit of the fire that you're talking about when you were talking about past political actions, could you see a groundswell of people coming together to demand for another kind of Canadian culture?
If you framed it as, you know, this is an opportunity to get right down to brass tacks, I think a lot of people would throw their weight behind it. I mean, I'm pretty sure everybody at the table would, but I think our peers would as well, and I think that we have enough clout these days, and let's not pretend that there's been real change so much as we're fashionable. We're quite fashionable right now. It's very much in vogue to have, you know, Indigenous engagement in institutions, and as far as I'm concerned, I mean, if the bees fly away from the hive and give me access to the honey, then I'm gonna access the honey, and I don't care why the bees flew away. I mean, I do because I like bees, but I think we could do it. I think it would be a lot harder because we weren't as worried about we had a different set of stressors in the 90s, in the early 90s. Things are different. I also think that there is a growing backlash, which would really, it would be a real battle. I think the forces of reaction and the forces of white supremacy are actually starting to feel a little worried, although I don't think they have that much to worry about yet.
As in worried and agitated, and
As worried and agitated
come to the surface.
Yeah, and I think those things are coming to this. Like, I mean, look at the rise of the alt-right. I mean, it's that is happening.
The resurrection.
The resurrection. Yes, thank you. The resurrection of the alt-right. I mean, that is really happening in a really big way.
Oh, for real.
And most people are just, right. This like, oh no, it can't happen here.
Yep.
Well, here's where it started.
Yep.
So that's what I think.
Well, when you said earlier that we're in a stasis, then it's more of, I was thinking more of a precipice, and mentioning the AGO deaccessioning group of 7 works, that's a sound financial decision, I think, too. If you look at the investment in these works, I think that, group of 7 are at peak value now. They've just only been rising up. And I think the work that you're doing and at this table, and that's happening more widespread, that can have, you said it's dangerous work because you think about the billions invested, and so there's literal financial implications to addressing these things that in the drop of value of that work. But then, like, the danger, the thing that people are so petrified of, is that this work is not going to be worth 10 million. It's only going to be worth 8 million. Right?
And so that's very serious for some people, clearly.
Yeah.
If anything, I have a faith in the art market and how the major players absolutely do not want the art market to shift. I mean, everything's set up as it should be, if that makes any sense at all. So the things that I'm proposing are catastrophic for the art market on a whole, really. And given we're talking about the Canadian scene and the non-existence of an art market in Canada at all, the fact that I'm coming at something so directly that is pretty much the only thing that has a market life, it's not entirely true, but going after this particular whale is a lot, right?
I really feel like for, a hypothetical person who is feeling fear at the devaluing of work in that way, it's just a failure of imagination. If they're invested in the art market and what they want is financial gain, because...
But there are people that function like that. There are people that buy work largely for the investment. It's just a different type of money.
But there's so much work you can invest in. It's going to be worth a bunch in the future, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Like, I don't know, hanging all of it on the group of 7 just seems like somebody is really, like, not being very creative about. I don't know.
That's a bigger conversation about the Canadian scene, right? There is that. I mean, really, the group of 7 is... in my mind, it is one of the biggest obstacles to the creation of any kind of new form of creative work. And I don't even paint, but I feel the impact of the group of 7 in my world, and what is possible to research and what things can be said. And, I think about the invisibility of these people that buy these kinds of works and the conservativeness of it. And again, I think about, what white people that have power do when they lose control. So I think all of those things are very real. And I think that the deconstruction of that world is legitimately dangerous for characters like us. And at the same time, thinking about in which activism is never safe. It's never been safe.
Not if you're doing it correctly.
So, is it possible?
I think we would need younger artists to step up. I think a lot of the artists who were young back in the day doing that work I think there'd be hesitation because of their positions. It's like, am I going to be committing career suicide by doing this? And that's unfortunate, but that's also real. There's also, our peers who would be like, lock and load, motherfuckers.
Yeah.
Let's do this, right? So it'd be really interesting to watch. Well, it'd be interesting to be part of.
And watch.
And watch.
True.
Yeah.
One last thing I wanted to kind of bring forward, we were talking about reparations and time. And I don't know if you had been following this in the U.S. Mitch McConnell had come out talking about how the United States should not be responsible for reparations to African Americans in slavery because nobody living had anything to do with it.
And how would we even know who to pay, he said.
Well, yeah. So that. And the fact that that conversation around reparations is being tabled right now,
Right.
I think is super important. I want to flag that it's happening in a bigger political moment in which Black and Brown Indigenous bodies are actively being slaughtered. And so, again, I keep thinking about the risk that comes with political engagement. The fact that there are people that are taking the risk of having this conversation at this time just really kind of emphasizes what needs to be done generally, and then perhaps it highlights the fact that we need to be doing that work here. And I think the challenge of offering that is that we're functioning on a Canadian landscape where anything political is just largely read as wrong. Just wrong. And why on earth would we be fighting against racism? Because there is none here, right? And all of those things, right? But I think that the work, perhaps the first stages of work would be the work of presenting the racism in and of itself and undoing that mythology. And then from there, bigger conversations around reparations, whatever that may be on this landscape, might be the next things that follow. I don't know if you have a comment to that, but I just wanted to bring that forward as something to consider.
I think there's a huge danger in reparations based on classification.
How so?
Like, because we're really locked. I've got this little card in my pocket that says I am legally speaking an Indian, right? I have friends who are way more Cree than I am, speak Cree, look Cree, and they are legally Métis,
Yep.
right? So, which means next to nothing in terms of legal stuff. Or no, they just changed that. My mistake. So if there were going to be reparations, which I don't think are a terrible idea in and of themselves, how would that money? There's just so much room for yet more internal division and strife.
Sure.
Right, based on so now we're going to do it on blood quantum.
Yeah.
Is that the idea?
Is that what happened 100 and some odd years ago?
Yeah, and it's fraught. It's really fraught. Do I think it's a bad idea in of itself? No, I really don't. I think some reparations would be a really great idea around our neck of the woods. I don't think it would hurt. Right, but I do think it would be very difficult to do it in a way that was just.
Yeah, well, that's any form of, anything involving money.
Yeah.
Has the potential for that strife and the corruption and the scrambling, but then that also acts like that money is still there. It's still going to other people's pockets, and is that a more just way of doing it? And maybe the conversation around reparations, if it can coexist with some other larger discussion, and maybe it needs a larger scale discussion of wealth inequality that's addressed as so it's part of a system as large as it is a part of.
Yeah.
I can imagine like reparations being paid to communities rather than individuals, or investments in structures such as schooling or what have you. But the thing about reparations as financial compensation is that is a language that speaks loudly to many people, and that the hypothetical value of having reparations in a contemporary context for the ways that history continues to resonate in the present is that it makes that connection between history and now, and in a way that is many people feel vulnerable to hearing.
Yeah, and a check is not wealth.
No.
too, right?
Yeah.
Writing a check saying
That's
it's
true.
going away, that's not wealth, but like, reparations don't have to be something like redistributing this money to account for something. Like it can just be going back to honoring commitments that have already been made. That's like, honor treaties, honor the territory, give Black people their 40 acres and a mule, right?
Yeah.
Like these commitments that have been already made.
Yes, absolutely.
Those,
Yeah.
all of this in this moment, and sitting here with you folks, and then returning to the idea of those paintings, and how those particular paintings, the group of 7 paintings, actually make me feel like I'm suffocating. Yeah. And that's quite sad.
Maybe the reparation is we repair all those paintings
Yeah.
with all of the things that were erased from them.
Exactly, or something, because the unpeopled landscape, right? That evidence of it's if you write a check, it's not wealth. These paintings are not wealth, but we're taught to believe that they are. Or I was just at the National Gallery, and they're opening their Gauguin portraits painting, and I'm just like, this is not wealth. This is how do you think that this is wealth? I think it's a great idea to sell these paintings. Get rid of them, make space for the real artists, the artists of the territories here, the artists that. People of color artists, Indigenous artists. But it really, like right now, I feel like those paintings make me want to die. So that's an interesting place to be at, I guess.
Here, listening to everyone, I was thinking, when we think of reparation, we automatically think of
Money.
And it plays out here, different kind of land claim settlements come in the form of money often, but if we could think outside of, like, I think you're tapping into it a little bit, what outside of money would be the reparation? So yeah, maybe return of land. I'm thinking, can we think outside of that? Outside of that kind of value?
Yeah.
I'm not sure, but then at the same time, I know that the sort of the money, it has such a value to those that have to give it up too. So there's something to that as
About
well.
that as well.
But yeah, it connects to what you're saying too, that these paintings are not wealth. Yeah, so where does wealth reside for you, or for, anyway, philosophy.
It's funny to get emotional and not funny. But I just think they're not beautiful. We are beautiful. And those artists missed out the possibility of making beautiful paintings because they left out our bodies, the bodies of all the people at this table. So they're not actually beautiful. And why would you hold up something that's not beautiful?